So I feel like I've seen a meme version of this scripture reading, which is the one where you see Jesus sitting. He kind of is pointing up, and there are people sitting at his feet, and he says, you're supposed to love everyone. And they say, wait a minute, but what about? And then they kind of list all these people, and he says, did I stutter? And so this is kind of the scripture version of that, where he says, oh, I actually want you to put the things into practice. I know that's very surprising. All you have been following me around, but I actually want you to do those things. Don't just listen to me. So it's very surprising. So today, this is the last sermon in our sermon series on the parables. This parable is known as the two foundations parable, or sometimes called the wise and foolish builders. And I was talking to Stephen Tanner this week. So yes, I reached out to Stephen to get some advice on building foundations. I hope that was okay. He had lots of good suggestions. He said that he told some people this was going to be about architecture and structural integrity, which made me a little nervous. So if you came for that lecture, you can leave now. I won't take it personally. So it's okay. So this speech occurs as part of the Sermon on the Plain in Luke. So Luke chapter 6. And that you may have heard of the Sermon on the Mount. So it's the same sermon. So the Sermon on the Mount is what it's called in Matthew. So in both cases, this comes after Jesus has spent the night praying. So he's gone up on a mountain, up in the northern Galilee area. He spent the night praying on the mountain. In the morning, he gathers his disciples around him, and of them he chooses 12 to be the 12 apostles. And then he comes down from the mount. So in Matthew, it's called the Sermon on the Mount because he's still somewhat standing on the mountain, looking down at the crowds, and he's giving the speech from there. And that kind of makes sense in terms of Matthew and his understanding. The Sermon on the Mount is longer than what we get here in Luke. It includes the Beatitudes and things like that. And it's a lot about kind of bringing the people up to be more godly. So it makes sense. So the people are kind of looking up at Jesus and trying to be closer to God in that way. So that's the Sermon on the Mount with Jesus kind of looking down. This is known as the Sermon on the Plain. So it said he comes down out of the mountains and he's on the flat place, and that's where he gives this. And that makes sense for Luke because Luke is a more social justice-focused gospel that has like Mary's Magnificat, and it's very focused on the poor and how we can all live together. And it's everything that's found in this chapter in Luke is also found in Matthew, but the verses are very focused on kind of income inequality, resolving conflict, how people work with one another. And so in this one, he's actually on the plain, and it's like he's with the common people. And in terms of where this would have actually taken place at that time, I was reading a little bit about this, and it said that there are lots of areas in the northern Galilee that kind of have these natural amphitheaters because Jesus wouldn't have had this amazing sound system that we have here. So he needs to stand in a place where people can actually hear him. So you figure he's either just kind of at the foot of the mountain speaking down, or he's kind of at the base of the mountain in more of a valley, like a closed valley, so people could hear him. But in any case, the crowd has come to listen to him. And this is just after he's had this night in prayer and this communion with God when he has this connection. And also it's worth pointing out, this happens just outside Capernaum, which is in the North Galilee, so it's just west of the Jordan River. And these are people who would be very used to the Jordan River flooding. So they get lots of earthquakes and floods. So talking about why this is something that will save you from flooding would have really resonated with people in that area. So Jesus says here in the Luke version, he says, the one who hears these words and acts on them is like a person building a house who dug deeply and laid the foundation on rock. Unlike those who hear it but don't put it into practice, that's like putting a house on the ground without a foundation. And in the Matthew version, it's a little bit similar, but maybe you've heard, I think the Matthew version is a little better known. It's where he says, the one who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock, or like the bedrock. But one who hears them and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who put his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. So there's a bit more of, it's more dramatic in Matthew that there's a big storm, and that destroys the house. Versus in Luke, it's that there's going to be a ruin there because it's not solid. And so I was wondering a little bit, I was thinking about income inequality because of Luke. And so I was wondering if maybe it would have been harder for peasants, especially in this area, to build on rock or to have that kind of structure. And if there was any kind of reference to Rome in this way, that maybe if people are looking to Rome to kind of protect them or save them, if this is him saying he's standing in that way for Rome. But apparently he's not, which I found kind of interesting. So even unless you were very, very poor and needed to move a lot, people would have built on the rock, either dig down enough that they can be on solid bedrock or move enough stones. This area has lots of limestone. So it would have been simple enough for even very poor people to build on rock. So instead of this being kind of a reference to income inequality, he's actually saying, like, what kind of an idiot wouldn't build on stone? Like, all of us would have realized that. All you have to do is maybe take an extra day to dig a little bit more, gather some stones, but there are tons of stone here. So this would have resonated with even, the poorest people around him of like, oh, of course, that's how you build a house. What kind of an idiot wouldn't build a house that way? So I thought that was kind of interesting, that that's just kind of a given, that that's what you do so that there's something solid. But one reference that he is making here is to Isaiah, and Jesus often references Isaiah in different ways. And in Isaiah 28, there's a reference to how the temple in Jerusalem is on the great stone, and the temple is like our foundation. So Jesus is sort of saying, if you listen to what I'm saying and you put it into practice, that's like relying on that foundation. So rather than just having the Torah that you're following or the laws and following those, if you're putting these teachings into practice, so rather than even Jesus himself being the focus of it, it's actually putting it into practice, is building on a solid foundation, rather than needing to go to Jerusalem and making a sacrifice there. So I thought that was very interesting, with the focus being on the action as the main difference. So it's interesting because the Matthew version of this is one, so I grew up Catholic, which I think you all know, and there are a couple Bible verses that I have memorized. And the Matthew one is one that I actually do have memorized for a specific reason. So where he says, not everyone who cries, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but only those who do what my Father in heaven wants them to do. And the reason was I grew up in an area where there was a little bit of tension between Catholics and Protestants. And it was understood that Catholics sort of have a good works practice, where the focus is on doing good works, so you want to do as many good works as you can. That's how you get into heaven. Versus Protestants or evangelicals in this particular area, believing in faith and the power of faith and grace, where it's less important that you act in a certain way because Jesus will save you no matter what if you have faith in that way. And there's a lot that can be said on good works versus faith. And it's really that both of those taken to too much of an extreme become less helpful, and I think are not a good foundation. Because if you say the only way to really have a good connection to God is to always do everything right and to live in to Jesus' teachings in a really literal way, then you're going to be really hung up on what the people around you are doing and whether you're more godly than them or not. And God forbid you trip and curse, or you accidentally say something about your neighbor when you're trying to work something out, or you tell a white lie. You'll get really hung up on that, and you'll think, well, maybe God doesn't love me anymore if I'm not as pure as possible. And so that can be kind of the downside of really focusing on good works. Or you can get really self-righteous. Like maybe you do a lot of wonderful things in the community, but then you can't wait to tell everyone about it. Right, you think you're so wonderful because of all your good works. So there's kind of a downside of focusing too much on good works. But then there's also a downside of focusing too much on faith. It is true that God always loves us no matter what, and that can be so life-affirming, that no matter what we're doing, even if we've screwed up, even if we've made terrible decisions, that God is always there for us, and we can have that connection to God and be saved in that way. But then if we kind of take that as someone who's like, oh yes, I believe in God, so now I can go do whatever I want. I can cheat my employees, or I can act in a terrible way, or I can be violent. It doesn't matter because I believe in God. This is also not so helpful. So this kind of touches on that, but I think Jesus would have been aware of some of that. Definitely people who either say, oh, well, I'm very good, like Jeff was speaking about last week, who consider themselves very holy and righteous, but then they're not actually living into the teachings. Or the people who kind of have the opposite. So just being aware that it's really like we want to have faith, but we also want to be good in what we do. And I think that really would have resonated with Jesus, where he's saying, if you're really following me, if these crowds are following me out into the forest, out into the mountains, and they really want to hear what I'm saying, hopefully they're going to put that into practice. Otherwise, what's the point of this, right? And so I was wondering, why would people do that? So at the time, why would people maybe listen to Jesus' teachings? Or today, why would we take the time on Sundays to learn or have a Bible study or take the time to listen, but not actually put it into practice? And so I think sometimes we can be kind of curious intellectually. We're like, oh, that's very interesting. I want to take some time to learn more. But we don't see how it relates to us. And I know I can be guilty of this too. There are certain passages in the Bible that I'm like, oh, yes, loving people, practicing peace, sure. Wait, giving away everything I own? Well, he probably didn't mean that literally. I don't think we need to go that far. You don't need to be a fanatic about it, right? But how often do we do that? Where we kind of take it as a thought experiment, but we don't actually practice it, right? And so you want to be careful about that. So there is that kind of, if you're going to overly intellectualize things, or maybe you're just really focused on subsistence. You're like, you know what, these are really good practices. I think it's a good idea, but I have a lot of problems in my life right now. I'm really focused on kind of making my life work, trying to pay my bills and taking care of my family, and maybe I'm sick or my relatives are sick, and I'm just trying to take care of everybody. I don't know, I don't have time to change anything else in my life. And I think Jesus would understand that. I think there are little ways that we can kind of act to kind of, how can we be a little bit more loving? How can we be a little bit more open, just a little bit more generous, a little bit more kind? If you don't have the ability, or for whatever reason, you're not going to go and drop everything and follow God in that way, I still think there are small ways that we can bring it more into our lives. But I think also sometimes we worry about failure. And that's why I think the idea of building on a strong foundation, if you look up kind of strength or foundation building or these kind of things, the concept of resilience comes up a lot nowadays. And so how do we have resilience? And everything, all the studies that are done about resilience say it's okay, it's really just doing small steps. So there's a great quote by this one woman, which I have here somewhere, I promise. She's one of the main researchers on resilience. And she says, we think that it has to be something huge. Often we think if we're going to be strong, it means we have to be fully strong or fully courageous, or it's this big dramatic thing. Her name is Taryn Marie Sejjakal, and she wrote the 5 practices of highly resilient people. And she says, remember, it's just taking small steps. That barely making it is still making it. Gasping for breath is still breathing and fighting on. Even when you feel depleted, it means you have the courage to keep showing up for challenging times. And I think that really would have resonated with Jesus. So just showing up, just trying to put things into practice, just in little ways, being a little kinder, having a little bit more of that foundation, just a little bit, and trusting in God that it'll work, that even if it doesn't solve everything, you can have a really strong foundation in a house, and there can still be a terrible flood that washes it away. There can still be a huge earthquake. It doesn't save us from everything, but we can put these things into practice little by little, and it will actually help us in that way. And I have, there's a quote in Philippians that I just thought was so beautiful, which I don't have with me apparently. But he just says, what is the whole gospel? The gospel is just opening up our hearts, learning to love a little bit more, learning to do good, learning to be there for our neighbors. If we do this in God, we can find peace. We can find the peace of Christ. So I hope that you can find that in your own lives. I hope you feel like there is a foundation present for you, even if maybe you've built on sand before this, that if you just dig a little bit deeper, just a little bit at a time, that there is a rock underneath you, and that you will be supported through this. And if you're not, you have people around you who can always help you rebuild when the time comes. Amen.